There's a movie that came out in 2004. It's called The Day After Tomorrow. The movie stars Jake Gyllenhaal and a bunch of other people. I'm sure I haven't seen it in a while, but the basic plot of the movie is that this acceleration of climate change creates these massive superstorms, these massive hurricanes of ice and blizzards and tsunamis and rainstorms, and basically these huge superstorms wipe out entire cities, entire states, entire areas of the globe, and it sort of brings in a new ice age, and that's kind of what humanity has to deal with. And of course, there's lots of cool special effects and love stories and all that stuff in the movie. And there's been variations of this movie over the last 20 years for sure, and I'm sure there's movies that tackled this topic beforehand. I can think of a movie called 2012. I think there was another one that had Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson, some sort of similar plot as far as these destructive, climate-changing, apocalyptic, cataclysmic events. Very popular Hollywood genre is what I'm saying. And I think that a lot of people have this very similar view of climate change in general. Let me tell you what I mean. So there is this Day After Tomorrow or 2012 movie view of climate change, where it's viewed as this globally cataclysmic nuclear annihilation style of destruction event. And I think this view of climate change based on a Day After Tomorrow style interpretation of it is misleading, and it causes problems not only for people who deny climate change, but also for people who are sort of advocating for watching out for the negative effects of climate change. And let me tell you what I mean. For people who aren't that worried about climate change, they will say, where are the destructive tsunamis? Where are the giant blizzard hurricanes that are spewing out dangerous icicle spears all across the East Coast? Why isn't half of the world living in blizzard conditions? Why don't we have The Rock falling out of some sort of crumbling skyscraper while he's shooting the climate change bad guys? So people will use this type of thinking to sort of minimize the impact that climate change is having by saying, hey, I was able to walk outside today and things seem pretty normal. I don't see any apocalypse happening, so climate change must not be that big of a deal. So I think that's the first way that this sort of Day After Tomorrow view of climate change can be very misleading and very problematic, that example there. But I also think that people who are trying to do the right thing and sounding the alarm about climate change sometimes do it, for example, by creating something like The Day After Tomorrow, which is this apocalyptic movie that doesn't necessarily accurately show what the effects of climate change will be. And in some ways, it gives ammunition to that other side of climate change deniers, so to speak, who can then say, hey, look, your apocalyptic climate change stuff, that's not happening, so this whole thing must be a hoax. In my opinion, the way we talk about climate change is important. Learning the history of climate change is important because it can tell us important lessons from the past that we can apply in the present and in the future, hopefully. And what this Day After Tomorrow view of climate change misses is that oftentimes, when you look historically at least, climate change in general is a gradual process that is going to incrementally impact real people's lives. It's going to impact government policies. It's going to impact the environment and the way we interact with the environment. It's going to create job concerns for a number of people. It's going to impact agriculture. And the cumulative effect of all of these changes is going to be massive for society. And when I say that climate change is a gradual process, I mean that it doesn't just happen with a snap of the fingers and then the climate goes from ice age to incredibly warm or whatever the case may be. A lot of times this happens over decades, over centuries, but that doesn't mean there aren't acute instances where changes in climate can create here in the moment events and crises that drastically change the way things are going in society. So in that sense, don't be lured into climate change as gradual and we can deal with it in 200 years, because in the midst of those gradual changes are going to be acute things that pop up that are massive crises. Just imagine things like floods, things like diseases that pop up out of nowhere because of changes in climate, and things like this. In my view, it's clear that failing to take a measured and reasoned approach to climate change and only looking at the short term is the surest way to screw this up as a species. But in general, people don't like thinking long term, don't like preparing for long term because there's no immediacy to it. Again, it's kind of like the action movies we've been talking about. What's going to do better at the box office? The Day After Tomorrow with these huge tsunami, massive blizzard storms and, The Rock hanging off a skyscraper shooting people? Or something like The Godfather that has a slow, steady build and there's lots of plot and nuance and character development. I haven't looked at the box office numbers, but my guess would be stuff at the top of the heap is going to be those action style sensationalist movies. So how does all of this connect to history? The point is that if we don't prepare for changes in climate and the way that that could impact the way we live as humans, we could be in big trouble, because it's going to impact all of those areas that we talked about earlier as far as the way humans interact with each other and the way we live our lives. And it might even have more drastic implications than that. And how do we know all this? We know it because it's happened before. We've seen examples of the way that changing climates and the resultant impacts of that have impacted entire civilizations, including maybe the most prominent ancient civilization of all time. Because we now know that climate and disease was not just some background force influencing events in a small way, but was actually one of the primary driving factors that caused the end of the Roman Empire. The fall of the Roman Empire is a big deal in history. I've talked a lot about historical narratives and big overarching historical stories on this podcast, and the fall of the Roman Empire is right up there at the top. And anytime you have a huge, earth-shattering, civilization-changing event like the fall of the Roman Empire, you're going to have different perspectives and different theories from different historians as far as what caused it. I don't want to go too far into the weeds here because I do want to be focusing on the climate and disease element of the fall of the Roman Empire, but there's a couple different traditional stories about the fall of the Roman Empire that we should probably know about. So the basic version of the fall of the Roman Empire that you probably got in high school or something similar to high school was that the western part of the Roman Empire fell in 476 AD when it was finally unable to withstand barbarian invasions and the political system fell apart. But in the eastern part, the Byzantine part of the Roman Empire lived on for another 1,000 years or so. Now, there's a whole lot of problems with that sort of simplified approach to the fall of the Roman Empire. And here's where you get into the nuance of it. What are we actually talking about when we talk about barbarian invasions? Is the word barbarian even a good word to use? Is the word invasion a good word to use there? Is that actually what was happening? Why 476 and why not 475 or 477? What do we mean when we talk about decline? Did the Roman Empire actually collapse? Did everybody that was living in the Roman Empire suddenly in 476 just decide at the snap of a fingers that this thing was over? Or was it a more nuanced process? Was it simply those quote-unquote barbarian invasions, or was it a combination of systems, political systems in decline, economic systems in decline, the Roman military falling apart? Was there some sort of moral element to this? Did the Romans sort of get what was coming to them? Did the rise of Christianity play any role in this? Why did quote-unquote Roman systems continue to exist and evolve in the East, but decline and fall apart in the West? Did the Roman Empire really fall in the West at all? Or is that just sort of a story we've told ourselves, passed down from generation to generation? So hopefully by asking all those questions, and these are all questions historians disagree with and debate on and have different interpretations on, and there's a whole bunch more elements to this that I didn't even mention there, but that's just some of the areas of nuance and disagreement that go along with the fall of the Roman Empire. So behind that basic veneer of a collapse in 476, there's a whole bunch of questions and problems that arise when you're trying to understand what actually caused the Roman Empire to fall. But most historians agree that fall it did. So we can argue about dates and causes and influences and systems in decline, but certainly by the year 650, the Roman Empire had collapsed in the West. There was no semblance of political organization that resembled anything close to the Roman Empire at its height. The Byzantines in the East were holding the torch of Rome. Many think not nearly at the level or holding that torch at the heights that the Roman Empire did at its peak. By 650, the population inside the area that once was the Roman Empire, the population was half of what it had once been, 50%. Financial and social systems were in disrepair compared to what had come before. Trade was happening on a much smaller scale than was happening at the peak of the Roman Empire. Historian Kyle Harper summarizes this collapse, if you want to call it a collapse or decline. He says, quote, "By AD 650, the Roman Empire was a shadow of its former self, reduced to a Byzantine rump state in Constantinople, Anatolia, and a few straggled possessions across the sea. Western Europe was broken into fractious Germanic kingdoms. Half the former empire was swiftly carved off by armies of believers from Arabia. The population of the Mediterranean basin, which once stood at 75 million people, had stabilized at maybe half that number. Rome was inhabited by some 20,000 souls, and its denizens were none the richer for it. By the 7th century, one measly trunk route still connected east and west across the sea. Currency systems were as fragmented as the political mosaic of the early Middle Ages. All but the crudest financial institutions had vanished. Everywhere apocalyptic fear reigned, in Christendom and formative Islam. The end of the world felt nigh." End quote. Historians debate whether this post-Roman period should be called a Dark Age. But the bottom line is, this was, if not a collapse into a Dark Age, then a serious decline and certainly the end of what was formerly the Roman Empire. It's very hard to debate against that point. So, what caused the fall of the Roman Empire? We listed a bunch of causes earlier in the episode and talked about different ways that historians think about the fall of the Roman Empire and how these different elements interact, and the way that there's not necessarily broad agreement as far as that goes. But historian Kyle Harper advocates for climate and disease to sort of be entered into that pantheon of causes of the fall of the Roman Empire, not just as some sort of background influence, but as a major player in why the Roman Empire fell. He's not saying it's the only reason, but combined with some of these other factors like human choices and global connectivity and the way that the Roman systems were put into place and changed over time, climate and disease play as big a role as any in the fall of the Roman Empire. Historian W. Cronin once said that, quote, "Environment may initially shape the range of choices available to a people at a given moment, but then culture reshapes the environment in responding to those choices. The reshaped environment presents a new set of possibilities for cultural reproduction, thus setting up a new cycle of mutual determination." End quote. Imagine a little diagram where you have environment on one side and then you have human choice on the other side. And there's an arrow going from environment to human choice, and then an arrow going from human choice to the environment. The environment, like it or not, shapes the range of choices that humans have available to them. And once humans make choices, that can impact the environment, which of course affects future human choices and current human choices. And that cycle continues. And it has continued throughout human history. And we know that this cycle was playing out during the Roman Empire. And Kyle Harper, in his book, The Fate of Rome, sort of sets out to show how this was the case. He outlines various Roman climatic periods, and he shows that climate is a wild card. And even subtle shifts or gradual shifts, like we talked about in the beginning of the episode, can be wild game changers for a civilization. Throw in the idea of disease and the way climate and disease play off each other and the way they in turn play off human interaction and human choices, and you have a recipe for a significant contributor to the fall of the Roman Empire. Disease in particular. Think of that diagram again of environmental influences impacting human choices and then human choices impacting the environment. Disease might be the ultimate example of that. The Romans built a huge interconnected global system of trade and commerce and political and social movement across a huge part of the known world. And these systems were often extremely conducive to disease. Historian Kyle Harper says, quote, "The empire was a great buzzing switchboard of cities. The Roman city was a marvel of civil engineering, and no doubt toilets, sewers, and running water systems alleviated the most dread effects of waste disposal. But these environmental controls were poised against overwhelming forces, a thin and leaky tide wall against an ocean of germs. The cities crawled with rats and teemed with flies. Small animals squawked in alleys and courtyards. There was no germ theory, little hand washing, and food could not be kept from contamination. The ancient city was an insalubrious home. Humble diseases spread by the fecal oral route, inducing fatal diarrheas, were probably the number one killer in the Roman Empire." End quote. Basically, you had Romans living in these huge cities across the empire. They didn't understand germ theory. They were crowded in together. They were living in this sort of domus complex where they were constantly in close proximity to animals and raw food and poor sanitation and feces and all this stuff. You add in the fact that the Romans were one of the great civilizations as far as dominating the environment goes. They were cutting down trees, reshaping environments, diverting rivers, all of these things. And that creates its own host of problems with the environment, where you might be pushing insects or pushing diseases into areas that they wouldn't normally be. But the real kicker is that the Roman Empire is so vast, and really the hallmark of the Roman Empire is the way that it's connected, and those trade connections, and the way that things are sort of standardized from one part of the world to another part of the world. Think about the Mediterranean basin and the different Roman climates and the different landscapes that is touching. Kyle Harper calls these ecological zones. You have desert, you have humid subtropical, you have temperate oceanic, Mediterranean, humid continental, cold semi-arid. And inside of this Mediterranean basin, there's all of these new landscapes that are interacting with each other in many ways for the first time at a huge scale. Basically, what you have in this disease and germ environment is the perfect conditions for the rise of the pandemic. Kyle Harper says, quote, "Germs are far deadlier than Germans," end quote. And in his book, he traces not just the ways that changes in climate impacted the way humans lived, but also how diseases and pandemics absolutely ravaged the Roman Empire at different times. And when you look at the different times that these pandemics hit, you can see how strong or how weak the Roman system was because of whether or not they were able to deal effectively with the consequences of these diseases and pandemics. Harper states his thesis here when he says, quote, "The Romans built a giant Mediterranean empire at a particular moment in the history of the climate epoch known as the Holocene, a moment suspended on the edge of tremendous natural climate change. Even more consequentially, the Romans built an interconnected, urbanized empire on the fringes of the tropics, with tendrils creeping across the known world. In an unintended conspiracy with nature, the Romans created a disease ecology that unleashed the latent power of pathogen evolution. The Romans were soon engulfed by the overwhelming force of what we would call today emerging infectious diseases. The end of the Roman Empire, then, is a story in which humanity and the environment cannot be separated, or rather, it is one chapter in the still unfolding story of our relationship with the environment. The fate of Rome might serve to remind us that nature is cunning and capricious. The deep power of evolution can change the world in a mere moment. Surprise and paradox lurk in the heart of progress." End quote. This idea that climate and disease played as much a role in the end of the Roman Empire as any other cause, whether it be barbarian incursions or human choices or political decline, this idea that climate and disease played a big role is disturbing for a lot of people. I think it's disturbing for the same reason that many other things in life and many other things in history are disturbing. A lot of times the things that impact us the most and affect us the most and make us the most unsteady are the things that are outside of our control. It feels better for us to tell a story that the Roman Empire fell because of these specific human choices. And if we can avoid those human choices, we can avoid the fate of Rome. It feels easier for us to link a chain of cause and effect to particular human moves, particular human choices at particular times so that we can connect the dots. But what Kyle Harper is saying, and what we said before, is those choices are constantly being strained by the environment. There's factors that are outside of your control, that are outside of the control of typical agents in history, that change the way historical events unfold. The climate and the way it impacts humanity is not just a background story happening while all these other humans are making choices that change history. climate and disease should be better understood as agents themselves that drastically change the fate of civilization. Another point that Kyle Harper makes that I think is on the money is his story of Roman decline is not a gradual linear decline story. So there's this tendency to oversimplify and say the Roman Empire ended in 476 and that was it and it was over and then something new started. But there's also a tendency to simplify in the other direction where you can say it just slowly declined and withered its way out of existence until one day it was gone. Kyle Harper doesn't like either of these approaches, and he looks at things more through the lens of this is not necessarily a linear decline, but rather a series of systematic shocks. Some of these shocks could impact the political system or the economic system or social systems or trade or whatever the case may be, but the way that the Roman Empire recovers from those shocks and the ways that it reorganizes itself changes over time, and you can actually track how was the Roman Empire as a whole responding to these shocks. And once you get close to 476, the stress and the shocks to the system ultimately proved too much for it to handle. All of that being said, before we try to go on and show how climate and disease impacted the fall of the Roman Empire, we need to have a little bit of an understanding of what the Roman Empire was and what it was like at the peak of its powers. The period of time that most historians point to as the peak of Rome being Rome, so to speak, is known as the Pax Romana. It goes from about 27 BC to about 180 AD. It's tough to pinpoint exactly the parameters that you're talking about when you're talking about what makes a golden age of a civilization, but for our purposes here, we can list some of the different elements that characterized this Pax Romana period. First of all, you have to understand that Rome during this period was going through incredible, although primitive, urbanization. The population was swelling. Historians estimate that at its peak, it was around 75 million people inhabiting the Mediterranean basin that made up the Roman Empire. Life expectancy for most people was around 20 to 30 years old, which might seem short to us, but we have to keep in mind that infectious disease was common back then and mortality was simply a fact of life before germ theory. That being the case, the population was still able to swell to 75 million people, which is not an insignificant number. So what were some factors that led to this population seeing an increase during this time period? Kyle Harper points to women having pretty high fertility levels and the fact that they were encouraged by not just the state, but also the culture around them to produce kids. So the natural question becomes, how do you feed all these people? Historian Kyle Harper thinks that this is an interesting question, but what might be more interesting is the fact that during this period of Roman prosperity, there didn't seem to be a lot of food shortages or widespread famine. He says, quote, "We ought to be struck by the broad absence of true subsistence crisis in the Roman world. Food shortages were endemic in the Mediterranean thanks to its naturally fickle ecology. Unlike the later Middle Ages, when violent spasms of acute hunger racked the population, the Romans seem not to have been haunted by the threat of outright mass starvation. The absence of evidence is never probative, but it is suggestive." End quote. It seems like the food supply was keeping pace with the huge population, And it also seems like the economic system of the Roman Empire was keeping pace with the population as well. Kyle Harper says, quote, "More important are the various indices reflecting high levels of production, consumption, and well-being in the Roman Empire. We lack proper economic statistics such as those gathered by modern states, so historians in search of Roman growth have often turned to archaeological proxies of economic performance. Shipwrecks, iron smelting, housing stock, public buildings, and even fish salting operations have all been cited as tracers of Roman productivity. They do in some suggest robust economic performance in the late Republic and High Empire, and the broad evidence for meat consumption, implied from tens of thousands of sheep, pig, and cow bones, is difficult to square with any picture of a society emaciated because the population had badly overrun its resource base. It is telling that archaeologists are usually the biggest believers in Roman economic development." End quote. If you combine this serious economic development that was happening during this period with a look that is more per capita, looking at sort of the individual person, you see that wages and rent and the price of goods was all trending in the right direction for people in the lower classes, people like unskilled workers. So we have urbanization, we have a huge population of people, we have tremendous economic growth, we have the food supply to feed all these hungry mouths. Technological increases during this period were impressive. The archaeology doesn't necessarily show any sort of technological revolution going on, but there does seem to be a spread and widespread use of advancements in the area of technology. In agriculture, for example, metal tools were common, plows, water mills. Advancements in mining and metallurgy were influential for the Roman economy. Sailing techniques and shipbuilding designs were spread across the Mediterranean. And what's really the linchpin of all of this is the trade that's going on in the Mediterranean basin. Historian Patrick Wyman, in his podcast series, The Fall of Rome, argues pretty persuasively that what makes Rome Rome is this connectivity between different parts of the Roman Empire. Whether it was grain from Egypt or olive oil from Italy or any number of other products from any number of different places across the Mediterranean Sea, the single biggest characteristic of the Roman Empire was the prevalence of trade, the fact that it was easy, and the global connections that resulted because of Roman systems being put in place. The so-called boons of empire. They cleared the sea of pirates. They allowed a dependable law enforcement system to be in place to prevent against pirates. They put in a stable currency that allowed people from different walks of life, different continents, to trade with each other. It's often said that the first thing the Roman army did when it showed up in a new territory was begin to start building roads. Connecting different areas was what made Rome Rome. Combine all of this with banks and credit systems that stood the test of time, and what you see is economic growth on a scale that the world had never seen before. Just to get a sense of the trade, here's the author of the book of Revelation talking about what would happen in a world without Rome. Quote, "The merchants of the earth shall weep and mourn over her, for no man buyeth their merchandise any more, the merchandise of gold and silver and precious stones and pearls and fine linen and purple and silk and scarlet and wood and all manner vessels of ivory and all manner vessels of precious wood and of brass and iron and marble and cinnamon and odors and ointments and frankincense and wine and oil and fine flour and wheat and beasts and sheep and horses and chariots and slaves and souls of men." End quote. A Greek orator by the name of Aristides said that, quote, You have caused the word Roman to belong not to a city, but to be the name of a sort of common race." End quote. That statement by itself, taken out of context, might seem a little bit silly, but when you put it in the context of this Roman economic development, this trade between these huge areas of the Mediterranean basin that includes 3 continents, Africa, Europe, and Asia, and it starts to make sense how the thing that made Rome Rome, as Patrick Wyman argues, is this global connectivity. People, money, goods, credit, food could all move from place to place very quickly in a matter of days. But as we're going to see, that concept applies not just to people and goods and money, but also to microscopic organisms and other disease carriers. Based on all that, it seems like we have this huge economic development, this system of trade and credit and banking and connectivity between different areas. And based on that evidence, historians can generally surmise that the people inside of the Roman Empire on a day-to-day basis during this time period of the Pax Romana generally seemed to, if not enjoy being Roman, at least for the most part not be actively trying to not be Roman, if that makes any sense. There weren't the kinds of famines and diseases and social upheavals that were happening at this time period that would later disrupt the Roman Empire. Aristides, who I quoted earlier, said that, quote, "All men pay taxes to you with greater pleasure than some people would collect them from others." End quote. Now, this was probably just him trying to get in good with the emperor at the time, and that's probably the reason he was saying that type of thing, but it gives a sense for this idea that for those that were inside the Roman Empire, there was this loyalty. There was a feeling of being Roman. That's not to say that there wasn't strife and upheaval and a class system. Much of this whole operation is built on the back of a huge system of slavery. But all we're trying to establish here is that there was a Roman Empire that was thriving by the metrics that historians use to determine if an empire is thriving or not thriving. It's more difficult to judge the well-being of individual people from so long ago with a limited amount of sources that we have, especially for the common folk during this time. But if we can show that this was indeed a golden age, then when things start going downhill, we can compare it with what was happening during the Pax Romana and gain some insight into the causes of the fall of the Roman Empire. Now that we've established that the Roman Empire at its height really was a sight to behold, it's important to note that the climate and the environmental conditions behind this Roman growth were incredibly conducive to empire building. This climate period that roughly corresponds with the Roman Golden Age goes from about 200 BC to 150 AD, and it's known as the Roman Climate Optimum. Historian Kyle Harper simply summarizes it by saying, quote, "The last centuries BC and first centuries AD were favored by a warm, wet, and stable climate regime rightly known as the Roman Climate Optimum." End quote. It's important to note that as technology is improving in the modern day and as archaeological systems of evidence are becoming more robust, we're actually learning more about these ancient periods in history than we ever have. And in part, that's because we now understand the science behind understanding what the climate was like hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands of years ago. Scientists look at ice cores. They can analyze geological records. They can look at sea sediments. They can make note of terrestrial changes like volcanic eruptions and desertification and shifting trade winds. They can measure solar radiation, variability in solar radiation. They can look at the tilt of the Earth and how that might have impacted certain regions or not impacted certain regions of the globe. When scientists look at all of these indicators of climate found on planet Earth, what they find is that over time, throughout the history of the Earth, the climate changes. There's a lot of technical terms for all of this stuff, but I think we're all familiar with the idea of an ice age and how ice ages throughout the history of the planet have happened from time to time. And when the last one broke and ushered in a warmer and wetter period, this period in climate history is known as the Holocene. The Holocene, on a global sort of scale, produced conditions in weather and climate that were favorable for the development of civilizations. And it's no surprise that you see the first Neolithic civilizations of sort sprouting up about the time that the Holocene is beginning as sort of a climate regime. I talked about this a little bit in my Early Man series, Against the Grain, but historians think that Mesopotamia, the Middle East, tens of thousands of years ago was probably closer to a wetland, sort of like a marsh. Looking at that today, we would think that's impossible because all we see is essentially desert in that area, but it shows this idea of how climate can actually change drastically over the course of time. Kyle Harper has an account in his book about the famous scientist Ptolemy, who's talking about rain in the city of Alexandria in Egypt. In the modern day, historians just thought he was lying because it never rains in Alexandria. But again, as Kyle Harper and some of these other historians and scientists have started looking more at the climate data, it's very likely it was actually raining in Alexandria during the Pax Romana. And just so we're all on the same page, we do have to make that distinction between weather and climate. Weather is the weather when you walk out the door. Is it raining? Is it sunny? What's the temperature? So on and so forth. It's what it feels like at the moment. Climate is more of the broad weather patterns that happen over the course of months and years, and generally climate remains relatively stable over time, although as we've been saying, it can change drastically over the years, but weather is more unpredictable and changes from day to day. But just because climate is relatively more stable doesn't mean that over time it can't change drastically. Kyle Harper says, quote, "Our planet has been a wildly unstable place, its past full of surprises. The last ice age, far from a period of unbroken cold, was characterized by violent swings in the global climate system. The climate of the last 100,000 years has been called a flickering switch. Our hunter-forager ancestors survived through times that were not only much colder, but also much more capricious. In a phase known as the last glacial maximum, which started 25,000 years ago, the frost pushed humans south, so far that only stretches of southern Europe remained habitable. Chicago lay under the Great Laurentide ice sheet." End quote. When you take all of this into account, it appears that the climate systems that were in place in the Mediterranean basin during the height of the Roman Empire were very favorable. This Roman Climate Optimum produced a high level of solar radiation compared with previous centuries. Typically, this means increased warmth. The amount of solar radiation was stable. It didn't oscillate by year or by decade as much as in other eras of climate history. During the Roman Climate Optimum, there was no extreme volcanic activity. It was warm. Glaciers were melting. We can look at the tree rings to determine temperature We can look at cave minerals, and all of those indicators say that the planet was warmer at this time. There was more rainfall. Flooding seemed to be happening more regularly in the Roman Empire. This is not always an indicator of humidity or rainfall, because sometimes floods are extreme events and sometimes they're caused by man-made deforestation situations where the Romans are destroying forests and consuming natural resources that could absorb floodwaters. But floods on the whole were more common during this Roman climate optimum and seem to happen in the summer, which very rarely happens in the modern day. So basically, as Kyle Harper already said, you have this warm, wet, and stable climate in place for the Roman Empire to thrive in. After this Roman climate optimum period, after 150 AD, things get more dicey. It's more dry, it's less predictable, there's less rainfall. At the end of the day, this Roman climate optimum matters. It matters for food production and agriculture. It allows for more food to be produced. It allows for more area of land to be suitable for agriculture. For example, just a 1 or 2 degree difference in temperature means that you can go higher in elevations, and that gives you a whole lot more surface area to produce food. So when archaeologists go and look at Roman sites, there's times where they can see that agriculture was happening in places during the Roman climate optimum where it wasn't happening in other time periods in climate history for the Romans. Historian Kyle Harper summarizes it by saying that the Roman climate optimum was, quote, a giant greenhouse, end quote, that engulfed the lands of the Roman Empire. We do have to be careful when discussing Roman climate history to paint in too broad of a brush and say that because the climate was like this, that forced the Roman people or the Roman Empire to do this in a deterministic way. Human ingenuity is, as we know, impressive, and the Romans were able to overcome climate disasters and climate changes just as humanity has for millennia. So we don't want to fall into the trap of environmental determinism where the correlation of Roman climate optimum with Pax Romana equals causation, saying that the climate caused the Pax Romana. There were certainly other causes. All we want to say is that for most of the study of Roman history, climate was ignored as an important factor. But what Kyle Harper and others are beginning to understand now is that climate, trade, technology, human interaction, human choice are all simultaneously acting upon one another and influencing each other. And all of these inputs produced the growth, expansion, and relative prosperity of the Roman Empire. So we don't want to fall into the trap of environmental determinism. And there's also another trap that we don't want to fall into when looking at this Roman climate situation. It might seem easy to make an argument against caring about climate change or caring about the impacts of the way a changing climate influences society because it is changing over time. I do sometimes see this argument today where some people will say, well, the climate has always been changing, so who cares about modern climate change? Sort of a naturalistic fallacy going on where they're saying, hey, it's natural for the climate to change, therefore we shouldn't really worry about it too much. So for those people, or for people who might be thinking along similar lines, you're exactly right. The climate does change. But look what happens when it does. Take a cue from the fall of the Roman Empire, because the Roman climate optimum was coming to an end around 150 AD. When we turn the page and get to the next chapter in this story, and as a new climate period came in, it would bring with it death, chaos, and collapse. If the goal is human well-being, shouldn't we prepare for that? Shouldn't we take it seriously?